Hi, my name is Adristi, and I'm going to start this presentation by answering the question of how has globalization influenced the political economy of Indonesia and what challenges might its legal system present for an Australian firm. Globalization itself refers to the increasing interconnectedness of countries through rapid development in communication, transportation, and technology. It influences a nation's economic, political, and legal system. Indonesia itself is a strong example of this because globalization has reshaped the three key components of its political economy. Before 1998, Indonesia itself had an authoritarian and highly centralized political system. Power was really concentrated, the military had strong influence, and democratic participation was really limited. However, globalization contributed to major political reforms after 1998 during the Reformation period. These changes helped transfer Indonesia into a more democratic system with greater political openness and decentralization. On the positive side, globalization helped promote democracy through global expectations of transparency and accountability. It increased public participations in politics, improved governance through digital technologies, and strengthened Indonesia's role in international relations. As a result, Indonesia became more open and democratic. However, globalization also created challenges. It reduced state sovereignty as multinational corporations and global institutions gained influence. Indonesia became more exposed to foreign pressures and global economic shocks. Additionally, there has been some rise in political tension and instability in response to global influences. Moving to its economic system, Indonesia has a mixed economic system, combining capitalism with government control. Globalization has influenced the system through trade liberalization, foreign direct investment, and access to global markets and technology. These changes brought significant benefits, including increased economic growth, access to cheaper goods, expanded export markets, and industrial development through technology transfer. In fact, Indonesia's GDP per capita increased significantly after liberalization, by around 40% after 5 years and 76% after 10 years. As you can see from the graph, Indonesia's economy has been linked to globalization for centuries, starting with trade in natural goods during the colonial era. By the 1950s, industrialized countries relied on Indonesia for raw materials. However, in the past 3 decades, global manufacturing has expanded rapidly, shifting Indonesia's role from mainly exporting raw resources to participating more in industrial production. This highlights how quickly globalization can transform an economy. Looking at its legal system, Indonesia's legal system is based on civil law, inherited from Dutch colonial rule. However, globalization has shaped it into a hybrid system that combines civil law, customary law, and Islamic law in certain regions. Globalization has improved legal standards by aligning Indonesia with international practices and strengthening cooperation with other countries. Those are some advantages. But at the same time, this has made the legal system more complex and sometimes inconsistent. For Australian businesses, Indonesia's legal system presents several challenges. First, foreign companies must establish a PTPMA, which is a foreign owned company structure. This involves high minimum capital requirements, typically around 1 million AUD, at least two shareholders, and in some sectors, local partners are required. Second, the licensing system is really complex. Indonesia uses a risk based approach, meaning businesses must select the correct classification code. Errors can lead to penalties or invalid permits, and higher risk industry require multiple approvals. These factors make market entry more costly and complicated for sure. As you can see, a clear real life example of these challenges is Tesla. The company canceled its plan to invest in Indonesia due to its legal complexity, which may discourage foreign investment. In 2019, Joko Widodo also expressed concern when 33 companies relocating its investment from Indonesia to Vietnam, where regulations are more simple and permits can be obtained more quickly. Next, my friend Aisha will discuss about the Indonesia economic and human development.
Hi, I'm Aisyah, and I will analyze Indonesia's level of economic and human development and evaluate which measure is most important for an Australian firm considering market entry. Indonesia is one of the Southeast Asia's larger emerging economies, making it highly relevant for international business expansions. Starting with economic development, Indonesia's gross national income per capita is approximately 5,000 US dollars, according to the World Bank. This suggests only moderate income levels at first glance. However, when adjusted using purchasing power parity, income increases to approximately 14,470 US dollars. This difference is critical because PBP accounts for lower living costs and therefore reflects real purchasing power. As a result, PPP provides a more accurate representation of consumers' actual ability to spend, revealing a much stronger market potential than GNI alone suggests. Next, in terms of human development, Indonesia has a Human Development Index score of approximately 0.728, as reported by the United Nations Development Programme. This places Indonesia in the high human development category. This reflects improvement in life expectancy, education, and income level. However, development remains uneven, particularly between regions like Java and more rural provinces. As argued by Amartya Sen, development should be measured by capabilities and quality of life, not just income, reinforcing the importance of HDI as a complementary measure. Moreover, Indonesia's current development must be understood in a historical context. Let me bring you to Indonesia before 1998. Under Suharto, Indonesia operated under an authoritarian system with limited economic freedom and lower development outcomes. Following the reformasi period, Indonesia transitions into a democratic and market based economy. The shift has driven consistent economic growth and the emergence of a large middle class. This demonstrates how political systems directly influence economic and human development. Then, this leads to the key questions. Which measure of development is most important for an Australian firm entering Indonesia? The answer is purchasing power parity, PPP, is the most important measure because it directly reflects real consumer purchasing power, which ultimately drives demand for products and services. By capturing what consumer can actually afford, PPP allows firms to design more effective pricing strategies and better assess the size and potential of the middle class market. In contrast, gross national income (GNI) can underestimate true market potential, while the Human Development Index, although valuable for understanding broader social conditions, does not directly indicate profitability or revenue opportunities. In conclusion, while GNI, PPP, and HDI should all be considered together, PPP stands out as the most strategically important measure. This is particularly relevant in the case of Indonesia, which represents a strong opportunity for Australian firms due to its expanding middle class and rising purchasing power.
Hi, I'm Icha and I'll be taking over from Aisha. After analyzing Indonesia's economic and human development in question 2, I will now move on to question 3, which examines the cultural difference between Indonesia and Australia and whether these cultures are becoming more similar or more different over time. To analyze this, we use two key frameworks. First one is Hofstede Cultural Dimensions, which compares key cultural values, and Ronan and Shinkor's Cultural Clusters, which group countries based on shared characteristics. These help us understand both differences and patterns of cultures. Starting with Indonesia, Indonesia is highly collectivist with a score of 5, meaning people prioritize group harmony and relationship over individual goals. It also has a high power distance of 78, showing a hierarchical society where authority is respected and decisions are made top down. Uncertainty avoidance is 48, indicating a moderate flexibility but still a preference for stability. Indonesia's long term orientation is 29, reflecting a more traditional mindset focused on maintaining norms. For indulgence, it scores 38, meaning behavior is more controlled by social expectations, and masculinity is 46, showing a more balanced relationship oriented culture. Now moving to Australia. Australia is highly individualistic with a score of 73, meaning independence and personal success are strongly valued. It has a lower power distance of 38, showing a more equal and informal society. Its uncertainty avoidance is 51, which is similar to Indonesia. Australia's long-term orientation is 56, making it more future-focused. For indulgence, it scores 71, meaning people value enjoyment and freedom. And for masculinity, it's 61, showing a more achievement and driven culture. So comparing the two, the biggest difference are in individualism, power distance, and indulgence. Australia is far more individualistic, while Indonesia are strongly group-oriented. Indonesia also has a much higher level of hierarchy, while Australia is more equal. And Australia places more emphasis on personal enjoyment, while Indonesia is more restrained. Other dimensions like masculinity and long-term orientations show moderate difference, while uncertainty avoidance is relatively similar. Overall, this indicates a high cultural distance, especially in values that influence behavior and decision making. This is further supported by the Ronan and Shankar cultural clusters. Australia belongs to the Anglo cluster, which is typically individualistic, low in hierarchy, direct in communication, and performance driven. This explains why Australian workplaces are more participative, with faster and more individual decision making. In contrast, Indonesia is part of the Far Eastern cluster, which is collectivist, high in hierarchy, indirect communications, and focus in harmony. As a result, Indonesia workplace tend to be more hierarchical, where communicates is more indirect and decisions are often slower and group-based. So these framework enforce that difference are not just in values, but also in how people behave, communicate, and make decisions in real business settings. However, there is some evidence of convergence. Globalization has increased Indonesia's exposure to global media, digital technology, and international brands. This is especially seen among younger generations who are adopting more global lifestyles and becoming more open to individual expressions. In addition, the growth of international business and education means that Western management practices are increasingly being introduced into Indonesia. So these factors are gradually making certain aspects of culture more similar over time. However, strong divergence still remains. Key difference in hierarchy, collectivism, and communication style continue to persist. For example, Australia encouraged direct communications and open discussions, while in Indonesia values indirect communications and respect for authority. These differences are deeply embedded in culture, values, and social structures, meaning they are slow to change despite global influences. Overall, while some convergence is occurring, divergence still dominates between Indonesia and Australia. This is important for businesses because strategies must be adapted to each cultural context. In Australia, companies can use individual focused messaging and open communications, while in Indonesia, businesses should focus more on group values and relationship, also respecting hierarchy. So next, Adam will explaining how Indonesia should specialize in trade using Adam Smith and David Ricardo's theories.
Hello everyone, my name is Suwarna. My student ID is 35458887, and in this presentation, I'll be answering question 4, which theories Adam Smith or David Ricardo Indonesia should follow in international trade. This analyst draws on classical trade theory, empirical studies, based on Balasat 1965, Widodo 2007, Purwono 2022, and Esquivias and Haryanto 2020. Supported by verified trade data from OEC 2024, Uncomtrade, and BPS. Empirical evidence revealing Indonesia true trade advantage. Indonesia exported 297 billion US dollar in 2024 based on OEC 2024, with coal, palm oil, vernickel, copper ore, and gas dominating the export basket. Major partner, China, the US, India, Japan, and Singapore show a broad demand base. RCA data confirms strong competitiveness in palm oil, coal, and nickel-based products. This pattern raised a central question. Should Indonesia specialize based on Smith theory, absolute advantage, or comparative advantage as what Ricardo theory is, to maximize long-term gains? Adam Smith, absolute advantage. Specialize where you are naturally more efficient. Smith's theory suggests Indonesia should specialize where it's most productive outright. Data support Indonesia controls 49% of global palm oil export, earned 34 billion US dollar from coal, and export 13 billion US dollar in ferronickel based on OEC 2024. This sector reflects clear natural endowments and global dominance. Under Smith, Indonesia would double down on this sector because they delivered the strongest absolute productivity edge. On the other hand, Ricardo comparative advantage shift from the focus to relative efficiency. Indonesia RCA values show strong comparative advantage in palm oil, coal, nickel, and copper, but also emerging strength in downstream processing like ferronickel and industrial fatty acid, based on the OEC 2024. This means Indonesia benefits most by specializing where its opportunity cost is lowest, not necessarily where it's the world best. This support Indonesia move from raw material towards resource-linked manufacturing, which theory Indonesia should follow. When we confront theory with Indonesia's data, a pure Smithian strategy appears too restrictive. Indonesia clearly has absolute advantage in palm oil and several mineral products, but its developed ambition go beyond being a raw commodity superpower. The government is actively promoting downstreaming in nickel and other mineral to build an EV and metal processing ecosystem, a move that is rational only when we think in comparative, not absolute. In turn, Indonesia may not be the world's most effective EV battery producer yet, but relative to its own alternative, such as remaining an unprocessed or export, the opportunity cost of moving downstream is attractive. Ricardo's framework, which emphasizes relative efficiency and opportunity cost, therefore provide a more realistic and flexible guide for Indonesia's trade and industrial strategy than Smith's absolute advantage alone. Why Ricardo's theory fits Indonesia's trade path the best? Ricardo theory is thus not conceptually elegant. It is operationally useful for Indonesia's current transition. The export data show a country still anchored in commodities, but increasingly present in processing and basic manufacturing. A comparative advantage perspective legitimates this dual strategy. Maintain specialization where Indonesia's relative efficiency is the highest today, such as palm oil, coal, nickel, and copper, while deliberately investing to shift comparative advantage toward downstream and resource-linked manufacturing. This is also consistent with empirical work using revealed comparative advantage indices, which typically place Indonesia in resource-based and low to medium tech segments, but highlights scope for upgrading as capabilities accumulated. In short, Ricardo's framework provides a coherent way to manage the tension between exploiting current strength and building future ones. What should Indonesian government follow in international trade? For Indonesian government, the most coherent strategy is to treat Ricardo comparative advantage as the primary compass for trade policy, while using Smith's absolute advantage to validate and reinforce sector where Indonesia is already globally dominant. In practice, this means continuing to specialize in palm oil, coal, nickel, and copper, but doing so in a way that systematically pushes the economy into higher value segments, such as oleochemical, EV batteries, and metal-based intermediate goods. Comparative advantage provide the logic for prioritizing this sector. They offer the best trade-off between current capabilities and future potential, while industrial policy and investment can gradually reshape Indonesia's comparative position. By following this path, Indonesia can convert its natural resources base into a platform for diverse, resilient, and high-income trade integration. Thank you, that's all from me. Moving on to question 5 will be continued by my good friend Rama.
Hi, my name is Rama, and I will continue with the last question, which is question number 5, about Indonesia's trade policy instrument and what theories does this use of trade policy instrument support. Indonesia uses a range of trade policy instruments to manage its economic development. Instead of relying purely on free trade, the government actively intervenes using three main components, which are tariffs, non tariff barriers, and export controls. Tariffs increase the price of imported goods, non tariff barriers restrict market access through regulations, and export controls limit raw material exports to encourage domestic processing. I will start with the first instrument, which is tariffs. Indonesia applies tariffs on goods such as steel, electronics, and manufactured products. On average, Indonesia's applied tariff rate is around 7 to 8%, although tariffs on sensitive industries such as automotive and steel products can range between 10% and 20% according to World Trade Organization in 2023. These tariffs increase the price of imported goods, making domestic products more competitive. As a result, local industries such as Krakatau Steel benefit from reduced foreign competition. For example, safeguard measures and tariffs on steel imports contributed to a decline in certain steel imports and helped stabilize domestic production levels. In terms of economic impact, tariffs have supported domestic production and employment. The manufacturing sector contributes approximately 90% of Indonesia's GDP, showing its importance to the economy. However, tariffs also create costs. Higher import prices increase production costs for firms that rely on imported inputs, and this can reduce overall efficiency in the economy. In terms of theory, this approach reflects mercantilism as it focuses on restricting imports to strengthen domestic industries. Now, for the second instrument is non-tariff barriers. Indonesia uses non-tariff barriers such as halal certification requirements and TKD and local content rules, which aim at fostering an economic environment that supports the growth of local industries, reduce reliance on imports, generates employment, and boosts the competitiveness of domestic products. However, in 2026, Indonesia has shifted its rice policy significantly. Instead of using import quotas, the government has adopted a zero import policy for rice, meaning no rice imports are allowed. This policy aims to achieve food self sufficiency and protect domestic farmers. As a result, Indonesia now relies entirely on domestic production to meet demand. The economic impact is that domestic farmers benefit from higher demand and stable prices. National food security is strengthened. However, there is a risk of higher prices or shortage if domestic supply is mismanaged. In terms of theory, they strongly support mercantilism as Indonesia is prioritizing domestic production over imports. It also goes against comparative advantage since Indonesia may still import more efficiently from countries like Thailand or Vietnam but chooses not Now, to. For the third and most important instrument is export restrictions. A key example is Indonesia's nickel ore export ban introduced in 2020. Instead of exporting raw nickel, companies are required to process it domestically into higher value products such as stainless steel and electric vehicle batteries. This policy has had a major measurable impact on Indonesia's economy. First, it attracted around 30 billion US dollars in investment into the nickel supply chain, mainly in smelters and processing industries. As a result, the number of smelters increased significantly from just two smelters before the policy to over 13 by 2020, with continued expansion afterwards. Second, production has surged. Indonesia now produces two-thirds of global nickel output, making it the world's dominant supplier. Third, the policy has expanded industrial capacity. Indonesia currently has around 55 nickel processing facilities, showing how the export ban directly led to large scale industrial development. In terms of theory, this policy strongly reflects modern trade theories. It aligns with new trade theory because it creates economics of scale in a strategic industry and it supports product lifecycle theory as Indonesia moves from raw material exports to advanced manufacturing.
To sum up our presentation, we can conclude that first, globalization has transformed Indonesia's political economy, shifting it from a centralized authoritarian system toward a more democratic, open, and internationally connected economy. Second, economic development is growing through trade, FDI, exports, and technology transfer. But PPP is the most useful measure for firms because it shows real purchasing power, pricing potential, and middle class demand. Third, culturally, Indonesia and Australia remain quite different. We can see that Indonesia is more collectivist and hierarchical, while Australia is more individualistic and egalitarian. So firms need culturally adapted leadership, communication, and marketing strategies. Fourth, in trade, Indonesia should follow Ricardo's comparative advantage, focusing on palm oil, coal, nickel, minerals, and moving into higher value industries such as EV batteries, metal products, and oleochemicals. Last but not least, for Australian firms, Indonesia offers strong market opportunities, but success require careful attention to legal compliance, and it also requires PT/PMA rules, licensing, KBLI codes, ownership limits, and local regulatory differences. That's all for our presentation. Thank you.